There are things in this world that we don't understand, hidden in the dark, silent corners of our forests. Some people say it's just folklore, but others, they know the truth. That when you're in the woods, you're never truly alone. Each story, eerily similar, paints a chilling picture of an unknown watcher in the woods. Are these tales a mere coincidence, or something far more sinister? Enjoy. I remember it like it was yesterday. The day we decided to go camping in those deep, ancient woods. It's the kind of place that feels like it's holding its breath and watching you as much as you're watching it. The idea was to get away from the city, away from the noise, the screens, the endless buzz of our day-to-day life. We wanted a bit of an adventure, a touch of the wild, if you will. The forest, with its towering trees and stories of untouched nature, seemed like the perfect spot. It was me, Mike, Jenna and Sarah. We arrived late afternoon. The sun was dipping low, throwing long shadows between the trees and making the forest seem alive, dancing almost. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth, a smell you forget exists when you're surrounded by concrete all the time.
"Looks like something out of a fairy tale,"
Jenna said, her eyes wide, taking in the sprawling canopy above. We found a clearing not too far from the main trail. Close enough that we felt safe, but isolated enough to pretend that we were the only people in the world. Setting up the tents was a team effort. Mike took the lead, hammering stakes into the ground while Sarah and I unrolled sleeping bags. Jenna busied herself with gathering firewood. As night fell, the forest transformed. The once welcoming trees now loomed over us, their branches creaking in the gentle wind as if whispering secrets. We lit a fire, the flames casting a warm, comforting glow against the creeping chill of the woods at night. We roasted marshmallows, telling jokes and laughing, the sounds seeming loud and strange in the vast silence of the forest. And that's when we first heard it. A sound distinct from the usual rustle of leaves or distant animal calls. A snap of a twig. Heavy. Deliberate. Like something big was shifting weight. We all paused, glancing at each other, our smiles fading a bit.
"It's probably just a deer,"
Mike said after a moment, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. We tried to brush it off, get back to our stories and jokes, but the mood had shifted. There was a tension in the air, a prickling on the back of my neck like we were being watched. I noticed Jenna glancing over her shoulder, her laughter a bit forced. Later, when we crawled into our tents, the forest felt claustrophobic. The canvas walls felt too thin, the darkness outside too dense, like it was pressing against us. I lay there, listening to the sound of the night, each snap of twig or rustle of leaves making my heart race. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, but it was a restless, uneasy slumber. The next morning we awoke to the golden light of dawn filtering through the trees. Everything seemed so peaceful, so normal. We cooked breakfast over the fire, the previous night's fears now seeming silly in the light of day. But as we hiked deeper into the forest that morning, I still couldn't shake the feeling of unease at the back of my mind. The trees were so tall, the trunks so thick, that I felt like walking through a green cathedral. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, leaving much of our path dappled in shadow. It was during this hike that we first saw something, a figure in the distance, fleeting and almost missed. It was upright, moving between the trees, but there was something off about it. It moved awkwardly, its limbs too long, its steps too uneven.
Did you guys see that?
I asked, stopping in my tracks.
See what?
Mike replied, glancing back at me.
There. Something moved. It was big, like a person, but not.
Jenna laughed nervously.
Stop it, you're gonna make me freak out.
But I could tell by her face that I wasn't the only one feeling the strangeness of this place. We continued walking, but the atmosphere had changed. We were quieter now, each of us lost in our own thoughts, glancing around the shadowy woods as if expecting something to jump out at us. That night, the sense of being watched was almost tangible. Laying in my tent, the sounds of the forest seemed louder, more intrusive. Snap, crunch, the sound of something moving, circling. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the city life had just left me unprepared for the wilderness. In the early hours of the morning, when the fire had died down to embers and the others were asleep, I stepped out of my tent. The forest was bathed in the moonlight, the trees casting long, twisted shadows. I stood there, feeling small and vulnerable, listening. And that's when I heard it clearly. The unmistakable sounds of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, but oddly irregular, as if whatever was making them wasn't quite used to walking on two legs. The sound seemed to come from all around, echoing of the trees. I stood frozen, fear rooting me to the spot. I wanted to call out, to wake the others, but my voice was stuck in my throat. I strained my eyes to see through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to move, obscuring whatever was out there. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The forest fell silent. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I stood there before the cold and fear drove me back into my tent. I lay awake until the first light of dawn, every creak and whisper of the forest feeling like a warning. We spoke little about what we'd heard, each of us wrapped in our apprehension. The beauty of the forest now felt overshadowed by the sense that we were not alone, that something was out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the image of that figure I'd seen, the animal that walked like a man. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow, anything but what my gut was telling me. As the sun set on our second night in the woods, I wondered if we'd made a mistake coming here. The darkness creeping in seemed filled with secrets, with a presence that was anything but human. And the worst part was, I knew we were no longer the only things on two legs in this forest. For some stupid reason, we decided to go for another hike, hoping it would clear our heads or something. The woods felt more oppressive than ever. The trees seemed to crowd in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands, and the air was still heavy, as if even the forest was holding its breath. As we walked, we noticed something odd. Large footprints on the soft earth. Too big for any animal we knew of, with deep impressions that suggested something heavy, something two-legged.
Maybe it's a bear,
Sarah suggested weakly. But we all knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk long distances on two legs, leaving footprints like that. We followed the tracks for a while, a mixture of curiosity and fear leading us, until they disappeared into a thicket we couldn't get through. We turned back. The mood among us is now one of unease. It was in the afternoon when things really started to go south. We were back at the campsite trying to make a fire. I was crumpling the newspaper when I heard Jenna's voice, laced with panic, calling us from the woods' edge.
guys. You have to see this.
We rushed over. She was standing before a tree, its bark covered in deep gashes as if something with huge claws had raked at it. The marks were fresh, sap oozing from the wounds.
We should leave. We shouldn't be here.
Jenna said, her voice trembling. Mike tried to joke it off, but his laughter sounded forced.
Maybe it's just a really big bird. You know, like a mutated woodpecker or something.
Nobody laughed. We debated packing up and leaving right then, but the sun was already setting, painting the sky in fiery hues. We didn't want to navigate the forest in the dark.
Let's just stay one more night. We'll leave first thing in the morning.
Reluctantly, everyone agreed. As night fell, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. We sat close to the fire, the light casting dancing shadows around us. We were trying to keep a conversation going when Sarah abruptly stopped talking, her eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned, following her gaze. And there, at the edge of the firelight, something was moving in the darkness. We all stood up, backing away from the unseen presence. The thing stepped closer into the light, and we finally saw it in full. It was grotesque, a twisted form that lurked at the boundary of nightmare and reality, standing on 2 legs. It was covered in dark, matted fur, its back hunched and its limbs elongated and misshapen, but its face, that was the most terrifying part. It was almost human, but distorted, with gaping black eyes and a wide, drooling mouth filled with sharp teeth. Frozen in terror, we watched as it circled around the campsite, sniffing the air like a predator honing in on its prey. It made a sound, a guttural, choking growl that made my blood run cold.
Run,
Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. And we ran. We dashed into the forest. The only sound was our frantic footsteps and the monster's roars behind us. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long we ran before we realized that Jenna wasn't with us anymore. Panic-stricken, we called out for her, but only the eerie silence of the forest answered. Tears streaming down our faces, hearts pounding in our chests, we had to make a decision.
let's split up.
Mike suggested, his voice choking with fear.
2 of us look for Jenna. 2 go back to the campsite for supplies.
I hated the idea. Every horror story ever warns you to never split up. But what choice did we have? Sarah and I went to search for Jenna, while Mike and another friend headed back to the campsite. Searching for Jenna was like chasing a ghost. The forest seemed endless, each area looking the same as the last. Our calls for her went unanswered. Despair set in, deep and dark. After what felt like hours, but with no sign of Jenna, Sarah and I decided to head back to the campsite, hoping the others had more luck. Navigating through the pitch darkness was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise a signal of something dreadful lurking nearby. We arrived at the campsite to a scene of chaos. The tents were torn, our supplies scattered, and our friends, there was no sign of them. Desolation overwhelmed me. We were lost in this cursed forest with a monster on our loose, and no idea where our friends were. Sarah and I huddled together beside the ruined fire pit, too scared to move, jumping at every sound. The night was cold, so long, filled with fear. The creature's haunting howls echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of our hopeless situation. We were going to die in this forest. As dawn broke, painting the sky a pale, sorrowful light. We knew we had to make a move. Stay here and wait for a rescue that might never come, or venture out and face whatever horrors lay in wait. With heavy hearts, we chose the latter, stepping once more into the depth of the forest. We had to find our friends. We had to find a way out, but above all, we had to survive. The morning sun filtered through the trees, offering very little comfort. Our situation was dire, lost, unarmed, and hunted. Sarah and I moved cautiously, alert to any sound, any movement that might signal danger. We hadn't gone far when we stumbled upon Jenna's backpack, torn and discarded by the side of a narrow trail. My heart sank. The bag was empty, her supplies gone. It was a grim sign, and I felt a pang of despair, but I shoved it down. We had to stay focused, stay hopeful.
We'll find her,
I said to Sarah, though my voice trembled. We pressed on, calling out for Jenna and our other friends. But with every step, the silence of the woods seemed to mock us. The oppressive atmosphere, the feeling of being watched, it never left us. I kept thinking about the creature, its grotesque, almost human-like face, and shuddered. Hours passed. Our shouts became weaker, more desperate. Then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, we saw her. Jenna, laying motionless by a tree. We rushed over. We found her unconscious but alive. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by renewed fear. We needed to get out, fast. With Jenna between us, barely able to walk, we made slow progress. Every rustle in the bushes made us jump. It felt like we were walking in circles, the forest never ending. It was then that I noticed something strange. Small, carved symbols on some of the trees. They were subtle, easy to miss, but deliberate. Looking closer, I realized they formed a crude trail. A glimmer of hope sparked within me.
Someone else has been here,
I said, pointing out to the markings.
Maybe it leads to a way out.
With no better plan, we followed the symbols. It was a harrowing journey, each step uncertain. But slowly, the forest began to change. The trees thinned out. The oppressive feeling lifted slightly. We dared to hope. Eventually, the trail led us to a clearing, and beyond that, a small, dilapidated cabin. My heart raced. Was this our rescue or another trap? Cautiously, we approached. The door of the cabin was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, it was dark, the air stale and musty. Old furniture lay covered in dust and cobwebs. It looked long abandoned. Then we heard a sound that froze our blood. A low, guttural growl coming from the back of the cabin. The creature. It had found us. In a panic, we scrambled back outside, but the creature was quicker. It burst through the window, landing with a thud on the ground. That grotesque face, those black, soulless eyes. It was a nightmare come to life. But this time, something was different. It hesitated, its eyes darting between us and the cabin. I followed its gaze and saw, to my horror, more creatures emerging from the surrounding forest. They were like the first, but smaller, less intimidating. A realization hit me then. A realization so bizarre and terrifying it almost didn't make any sense. The creature had been protecting its territory, its family. In a moment of insane bravery or madness, I stepped forwards, my hands raised.
We don't want to hurt you,
I said, my voice trembling.
We just want to leave.
The creatures didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched us with those haunting eyes. The tension was unbearable. Then, slowly, the first creature, the one that had been stalking us, made a low, chuffing sound, almost like a sigh. To my amazement, the others retreated back into the woods, vanishing as silently as they'd appeared. The first creature gave us one last long look before turning and disappearing into the forest. We didn't waste a second. Helping Jenna, we hurried out of the clearing, our hearts pounding in our chests. We moved as quickly as we could, not stopping, not looking back. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged from the forest. The sight of the park ranger station in the distance was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We were later told that we'd been missing for days. Search parties had been looking for us, fearing the worst. Jenna was taken to hospital and treated for dehydration and minor injuries. The rest of us were questioned. Our story met with skepticism.
We saw something in the forest. Some kind of creature.
But our descriptions sounded too far-fetched, too fantastical. The rangers spoke of bears and mountain lions, but we knew the truth. We never found out what those creatures were. Some said they were lost species. Others say that they were just figments of our panicked imagination. But I know what I saw, and what we experienced in those woods. Back in the city, life went on. But something had changed in me, in all of us. We were quieter, more thoughtful. We carried the forest with us, its secrets, its terror, and its wonder. I still dream of those woods, of the eyes watching from the darkness. I wonder if the creatures are still out there, living in the shadows, guardians of a world we were not meant to understand. But one thing's for sure. I'll never go camping in the woods again. It all started when a bunch of us, thrill-seeking college kids, decided to camp in the old Wilwood Forest. Legends said it was haunted or something, but you know how it is. We didn't believe in any of that mumbo-jumbo. It was supposed to be a weekend of campfires, marshmallows, and scary stories. But some of the scary stories only turned out to be way too real. The first night was all laughs and s'mores, but then stuff got weird. We heard whispers, like actual whispers, not the wind or animals. It sounded like someone was talking right outside our tents, but every time we checked, there was nothing. Nada. Zilch. But the second night, our nerves were kind of fried. I mean, who wouldn't be? But things escalated. Our stuff started moving on their own. My backpack was suddenly on the other side of camp. Ellie's water bottle kept falling over. We tried to laugh it off, but big mistake. It was the smell that hit us first. A rotten smell, like rotting meat. So strong it made your eyes water. We thought maybe a dead animal was nearby. And then we saw it. A figure. Tall, gaunt, and wrong in every way a human figure can be wrong. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet with its strings all tangled. But the eyes were the worst. They were like voids, sucking in all light and hope. Every time that thing came near, the air got colder and the whispers turned into screams that weren't human. It was like it was playing with us, showing up and then disappearing. We didn't sleep. I mean, how could we? Every time we closed our eyes, we felt it hovering nearby, smelling of death. The whispers said things about us, our fears, our secrets. It knew things it shouldn't have known. By dawn, we were a mess, huddled together, wide-eyed, scared to even breathe too loud. We packed up at first light, planning to leave this nightmare forest behind, but the forest, it didn't want to let us go. Paths we used to walk were gone, like literally gone. The trees were where they shouldn't be, and then we realized the figure was herding us, like sheep, back to the center of the woods. It was there, in the heart of Wildwood, that we found the old cabin. Run down, abandoned, and the feeling of pure evil emanating from it was undeniable. We should have run, I know, but where to? The woods had turned against us, and that thing, it was waiting, in the cabin. The air was heavy, like stepping into water, and the whispers were no longer whispers, they were cries, pleas from past victims, maybe. There were markings on the walls, symbols that made your head pound if you looked too long. We didn't see the figure inside, but we felt it, surrounding us, suffocating us with its presence. The stench was unbearable. I can't even tell you how we got out. It's all a blur of fear and desperation. We found our way back to our cars somehow. We drove away and never looked back. We don't talk much about it, but sometimes I still think we all believe it was just a group hallucination. But deep down, we know. Wildwood is still out there, and so is that thing, waiting. Next time you think about camping in some spooky old forest, just don't. Trust me on this one. We've all heard the stories, you know. Local legends about a spectral figure haunting the woods. Typical campfire tales. None of us bought into it, of course. Our plan? Set up tents, crack open a few beers, and laugh it up. The first night was cool. Starry sky, the whole serene nature vibe. But then, the air shifted. You could literally feel it. Like stepping into a freezer. And the smell, ugh. Imagine a week-old roadkill under a hot sun. And then came the sounds. Not just any sounds. Footsteps. But not the usual critters types. These were heavy, dragging, purposeful. We tried to spot who or what it was, but our flashlights hit nothing but trees and darkness. We should have bailed, but, you know, pride and stupidity, we stuck around. The next day was off. Shadows seemed to linger longer and the woods felt tighter, almost claustrophobic. Our usual jokes didn't seem that funny anymore. Night 2, it escalated. Our fire kept dying, no matter how much we fed it. Cold wasn't the word for it. It was like the air was sucking the very life out of us. And that stank of decay got stronger. That's when we saw it. The figure. It was this silhouette of a person, but all wrong, stretched out and thin, like someone had pulled it apart. Its movements were unnatural, kind of twitchy and erratic. And when it was near, you couldn't breathe right, like the air was thick with something ancient and rotten. But the worst part, when it looked at you, it didn't have eyes, just empty sockets. You heard things, whispers of your own thoughts, your fears, but twisted, dark, evil. It was like it knew us inside out and fed on what it found. We didn't sleep, of course. How could you? The whispers turned into wails, surrounding our tents, trapping us in a chorus of our own nightmares. Every rustle made us jump. We were losing it, bit by bit. Dawn was a relief. We packed up and got the hell out of Dodge. But Hollowfield wasn't done yet. The paths, they were all mixed up. The trees were where they shouldn't be, We walked in circles, I swear. And always, just out of sight, that thing followed. The stench and the whispers, our constant horrifying company. Somehow, don't ask me how, but we stumbled out of those woods. When we looked back, it felt like the trees themselves were watching, warning us. We don't talk about Hollowfield Woods anymore. Some nights, though, I wake up smelling that decay, and I hear the whispers. It's like a part of that place somehow followed me back. So, a word of advice: stick to camping in your backyard. Some places, some things, they're better left alone. You might not believe it, but I swear, every word is true. Grizzly Hollow. Ever stumbled upon it? Probably not. It's nestled so deep within the woods that it seems like another world. I was a park ranger there once upon a time, but I quit after that night. The shift started like any other. Evening patrol, ensuring campfires were extinguished, and the wildlife wasn't rummaging through the campus supplies. You know, the usual. The sky was a strange palette that evening, dark with ominous red streaks. A feeling crept over me, as if unseen eyes were fixated on me from every dark nook and cranny. I shrugged it off, blaming it on those ghost stories my colleague Joe loved to spin around. I hit the Miller cabin around 8 p.m. The place had its share of local folklore, some tragedy long ago. Details were lost like tears in the rain. The air grew colder, though, heavier. Then the smell assaulted my senses, like decaying meat. I almost gagged, scanning for a carcass, but I found none. Turning back, I encountered something more chilling than the stench. It wasn't whispers or voices. No. It was a pair of unblinking eyes, not attached to a body, just floating there in the dark, watching me. Every rational instinct told me it was an animal, but deep down, I knew no creature in these woods who could own such a gaze. I tried to call into the base with my radio, but the radio only gave me static. Classic. I continued my patrol, where the disembodied eyes seemed to follow me, never blinking, always fixed on me. My breathing grew heavy, my steps uncertain. Then, in the moonlit path ahead, stood a figure, impossibly tall, shrouded in darkness, as if stitched together from the night itself. The closer I got, the stronger the stench of decay became. It was overwhelming, suffocating almost. The figure's form was blurred, like a shadow made flesh, and those eyes, the same unblinking, haunting gaze now set in a discernible face. Two glowing orbs, not red like in Joe's stories, but a piercing, icy blue that felt like they were searing into my soul. Rooted to the spot, I was entrapped, not by fear, but by those eyes. The gaze was hypnotic, paralyzing. It felt personal, as if it knew me, knew my deepest thoughts and fears. Without warning, my legs decided they'd had enough and propelled me into a mad dash back to the base, the gaze seemingly burning into my back. I could almost hear a faint, amused sigh carried by the wind. Back at the base, I was a mess, sweating, shaking, babbling about floating eyes and a looming figure. Joe suggested it was some toxin-induced hallucination thing. The docs at the hospital agreed, attributing my experience to stress and an overreactive imagination. Also a classic. But sleep didn't come easy that night. I saw those eyes in every shadow, felt the gaze in every quiet moment. I couldn't return to the park. I couldn't even brave the darkness of my own bedroom without a light on. A few weeks later, Joe dropped by. He quit the Park Service too. He said he'd felt the gaze, seen the figure. He described the sensation of being watched, scrutinized by an unknown entity. He understood. Some in the town speculated about the legend of old Miller still guarding his land. Others whispered of ancient, unspeakable things that linger in the woods. But me? I steered clear of those woods, of any woods. I moved to the city where the streetlights kept the darkness at bay and the building blocks out the vast, intimidating sky. Yet sometimes, when the wind snakes through the concrete jungle, I feel it. A subtle shift in the air, a sensation of being watched, and for a fleeting moment, I sense the gaze again. Those icy blue eyes in the dark, watching, always watching. I've been working the night shift as a forest maintenance worker for years, and thicket forest is no stranger to eerie tales after the sun dips below the horizon. My job entails trail upkeep and vigilance for any oddities. Most nights it's a routine affair filled with the rustling of leaves and the hoots of distant owls. But this night, well, this night was far from the ordinary. As I began my rounds, the moon remained hidden behind thick clouds, casting an otherworldly glow upon the trees. The air was heavy with the scent of damp leaves, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on fallen foliage. The undeniable presence of something unnatural lingering in the air. I'd heard stories passed down by veteran workers about a particular entity rumored to dwell in these woods. They called it the arboreal spectre. It was said to be far from human, a creature with limbs that twisted in unfathomable ways, resembling a marionette gone awry. Its skin was said to be as pale as moonlight, and its eyes like abyssal voids that stole the souls of those unfortunate enough to gaze into them. The tale went on to describe how the arboreal spectre was not just a sight to behold. It was an entity that transcended the bounds of nature itself. It was rumored to possess strange powers that could warp the very fabric of reality. As I ventured deeper into the thicket, the sensation of being watched became increasingly palpable. My heart raced as if in rhythm with the rapid beat of distant drums. The night seemed to come alive with a bizarre symphony of sounds, but I dared not pause to identify them. My flashlight cast long, eerie shadows that danced playfully among the trees, each shadow seemingly harboring a sinister intent. Then, I glimpsed it, just for an instant. A figure, grotesque and twisted, standing among the trees, its pale form barely discernible in the inky darkness. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for the moment, the very concept of time seemed to unravel. And then, it vanished. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief, telling myself it was nothing more than fatigue playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was real. I knew I was being observed by something not of this world. Continuing my rounds, I tried to dismiss the encounter, but the feeling of dread clung to me like a stubborn stain. The forest seemed to grow denser, the trees taking on a twisted, nightmarish quality. The very atmosphere seemed to thicken around me. As I reached the heart of the thicket forest, I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in a sickly, otherworldly green light. At its center stood a gnarled, ancient tree, its branches extending like spectral fingers, and beneath the tree, there it was again, the grotesque figure, its limbs twisted in a manner that defied all reason. This time, it didn't vanish. It stood there, swaying gently. Its eyes locked onto mine. The sensation of its gaze was like an iron grip on my soul, filling me with a terror that went beyond any earthly fear. I turned and fled, my heart thundering in my chest, my footsteps a frantic drumbeat in the night. The forest seemed to contort and morph around me, as if it had come to life with malevolent intent. I burst out of the woods, gasping for breath, and stumbled into the safety of our base. My fellow workers looked at me with concern, but I couldn't find the words to explain what I had witnessed. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night in the thicket forest. I don't know what the grotesque figure truly was. Perhaps an unearthly being, a demon, or something even more enigmatic. But I know one thing for sure. It was an entity that defied the laws of our world. A creature that should never have existed in our reality. So, if you ever find yourself wandering into the thicket forest on a moonless night, remember this warning. The arboreal spectre is out there, lurking in the shadows. Once it locks its eyes on you, there is no escaping the terror it brings. A terror that transcends the boundaries of the natural world.